For the third and final time, I re-entered Felix Delacroix's memories. I will say that diving through a trapdoor into oblivion was a stupid idea. It was fully and completely my fault that I landed with a sickening smack on what I could only guess was concrete in the tunnels underneath my fake town of Brightwood. I didn't sense an impact, but I did feel enough striking pain across my skull for me to know that I'd hit something, hard enough to send me spiraling into the dark. So much for Alice in Wonderland. It wasn't the Mad Hatter I was following, however. Instead of a cartoon rabbit leading me into subliminal space, it was my brainwashed classmate who had seemingly disappeared through our quickly fracturing world where fiction and reality were starting to blur. At that point, I had been questioning his existence. How was he standing in front of me? The device which made him Kaz Isaacs was gone. And that was before he'd saved me, sort of, from my inevitable breakdown in front of hundreds and thousands of prying eyes watching our fake town. And now, I wasn't sure what or who he was, because a second version of him stood in my doorway swinging an axe with a teasing smile, along with a girl playing the role of Annalise. I remember seeing him very clearly. For reference, I will be referring to this version of him as Kaz, his wide and frantic eyes which were almost an entanglement of both Kaz and Felix, before I turned back to find that he was gone, and where Kaz's trembling hands had been grasping and pulling open the trapdoor were instead my own. I didn't stay in darkness for long. After having Kaz's memories cruelly used against me, I had found myself entangled with whatever spiraling consciousness he had left, as well as memories that had been suppressed deep down. Felix was a lot of things to me. In Brightwood, he had been Kaz Isaacs, while in the real world, another reality that had been stolen from me, he was a brainwashed psychopath. The boy existed as a true unraveling of the human psyche, a mind so twisted and contorted out of shape, filled with despair from the darkroom brainwashing. All he could do was kill as a puppet on their strings. When I initially had his memories forced onto me as a sick form of entertainment, I saw exactly what turned him into the psychopath who murdered my family and dragged me into Darkroom. Darkroom, the dark web organization responsible for turning me into L. Not just me, Allie, Olivia, Charlotte. Felix was the reason behind my conversion into L. He had sliced open my mother's throat with a choked laugh and hollowed out eyes with no mercy. And yet when given the opportunity to kill him purely for the entertainment of Darkroom's growing viewer base, I couldn't. Sounds crazy, right? I would have to be insane to not use the world of Brightwood to avenge my family. But I didn't want to. Morality aside, how could I possibly take out my newly discovered emotions on a boy who had been engineered from childhood to spread despair? Felix Delacroix was not born a killer. You can have your opinions on whether human beings are born contorted out of shape with the urge to kill already embedded inside them, but that wasn't Felix. I had seen him spiral into oblivion as a 15-year-old victim of a project spanning his entire life, as well as the present, where he was fighting between his original self, as well as the humanity which had bled into him through fictional Kaz Isaacs. Kaz gave him his emotions back, and the humanity he so desperately craved. Kaz made him feel like himself again. Against all odds, he was the miracle Darkroom didn't even know existed, a fictional entity strong enough to overload the despair which had shredded the boy's brain through the treatment, where his brain had been physically forced to enjoy his father and brother's murder. Now I was seeing his beginning. Admittedly, I thought Darkroom had engineered the boy from birth. However, I was wrong. In almost every memory of his which had bled into me, there was always a white room. Whether that was the white tiles of his kitchen where he had murdered his family in a fugue state, controlled by Darkroom, or a winding white corridor leading into the Red Room, where his humanity had been torn away. This one was no different, though I think out of all of the white rooms Felix Delacroix had found himself in, this one was his least favorite, compared to his other memories I had been forcefully subjected to. This one was cold. I felt icy shivers racking up and down his body, his small arms wrapped around himself to give him comfort. The room was too big. It was too white. The walls all looked the same. It reminded him of the time he had broken his arms. The emergency room. That was his first thought. Unlike the emergency room, however, there was no sign of a nurse or either of his moms. There were no windows or doors, and as his feverish gaze flicked back and forth, searching for a way out, panic began to twist and turn in his gut. He couldn't have been any younger than 6 or 7 years old, and I sensed contorted fear sending his stomach into his throat. The questions in his head demanding to know where his mommies were. It didn't make sense. His thought slammed into me. Felix remembered having chicken nuggets for dinner, watching Very Odd Parents with his older brother, and then crying when he wasn't allowed to play the grown-up game with the cars. He remembered being carried to bed by his mother, the sweet smell of her perfume clinging to her nightshirt, her warm arms wrapping around him and tucking him into bed. His other mother standing in the doorway singing songs to make him laugh. But now he was standing barefoot on ice-cold marble tiles in his pajamas against a wall with a line of other children. There was a girl standing next to him with pretty blonde curls tied into pigtails. She was clutching a stuffed toy, and immediately, Felix was jealous. Why am I not allowed this stuffed toy? Instinctively, Felix reached out to reach for the girl's hand. It was a habit he'd had since he was a baby. When Felix was scared, he grabbed for a comforting grasp in his vicinity. If there was some kind of attachment or a familiar grasp, it was enough to calm him down. Normally, it was one of his moms or his older brothers. Now it was the girl. Her hand was warm, and he liked that it was warm. It was almost as comforting as his mom's. To his surprise, the girl did not pull away. She only stared forwards with wide eyes, and when he squeezed her hand, she squeezed it back. That was enough. When the woman with dark red hair stepped into the room, holding a rabbit and then proceeded to snap its neck, the girl's clammy fingers entangled with his were enough. The initial reaction among the kids was screams. Felix thought the woman was going to let them hold a rabbit. Instead, she held the dead thing by its ears, waving it around like a toy. "From now on, you are not going to cry." She spoke with a tone he could not ignore. When Felix dropped to his knees, his gaze glued to pooling red, contrasting white tiles, when the woman ripped the rabbit apart with her bare hands, he was cruelly yanked to his feet. When he tried to cover his eyes, his hands were pinned behind his back. "You are going to laugh." Ignoring screams of fright, kids frozen in horror, she went on to mutilate the rabbit in front of them. The memory jumped forward. This time he was sitting cross-legged on a plastic chair in front of a man with funny eyebrows. "Do you have a mother, Felix?" The man inclined his head, and Felix shuffled back, folding his arms. "Yes," he said, matter-of-factly. "I have 2. "No. You have a family here, remember? You have lots of brothers and sisters." Felix shook his head, and I felt the first pricks of confusion blossoming in his mind. "I have my big brother Kai." The man's expression darkened. He twisted around in his chair and fumbled through his desk drawer. Felix leaned forward with curious eyes before springing back when the doctor turned back to him. He was holding what looked like a stethoscope. It looked like one anyway. Felix knew what one was because he had eagerly listened to the doctor talking to his moms when his heart had been listened to. Unlike a stethoscope, This thing had several circular metal disc-like things instead of one. When one of them was stuck to his face, Felix laughed at how ticklish it felt, but then another was stuck to his face, and then another. And slowly, Felix started to wonder if the man with the funny eyebrows was going to do something bad. When he leaned back, the man grabbed his shoulders and firmly pulled him forwards. "Okay, Felix," his voice was gruff. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer them. If you answer them incorrectly, you're going to get a small shock." "What kind of shock?" The man's lips formed a smile. "It's just a prick, but it will get worse if you do not answer my questions correctly." When the first prickles of pain began, when he proudly said all of the names of his family and his dog, Felix realized he was saying the wrong thing. It started slowly, like stars filling his face and head. A little bit scary, but he could grit his teeth and bear it. "Felix, can you please tell me who your family are?" Again, he repeated what he'd said, and this time, the pain was an explosion of agony that rocked both our minds. I felt it, even as a lingering presence. I felt what had been forced onto this frightened 6-year-old kid. It wasn't stars this time. It was lava. When the pain started to shake his body and he was grasping onto the armrests and then trying to tug the discs off of his face, Felix's thoughts grew cloudy. The man did not try and help him when it continued, running through his body and turning his brain to mush. His expression remained stoic when Felix started screaming, crying for his mommies and Kai. It was when his mind was blank, when his eyes were unblinking and his grasp on the chair's armrests had loosened, that I realized the sheltered little boy who watched Fairly Odd Parents and craved another's touch and security was gone. "Your family is here at Darkroom," the man had told him through his screams. And at that time, he had pushed away the thought, trying to plug his ears. Now, though, he welcomed any kind of release if it meant the pain would stop, if it meant the stars filling his body and mind would go away. There was a significant shift in his mind, suddenly, like a switch had been pulled. He stopped crying, his body relaxing against the chair. The man's lip had upturned into the smallest of smiles when Felix gripped the armrest, his teeth gritted. "Well," the man cleared his throat, "I'll ask you one more time, Felix. Do you have any family?" "Uh-huh," the man hummed, sitting back, folding his arms across his chest. "Would you like to tell me who they are?" "I have a family here," he whispered. "I have lots of brothers and sisters." "That's right. We're very happy to have you." After that day, the boy's mind worked a lot differently. Felix felt odd, but it was a good odd. He was curious about the White Room instead of fearing it. During every lunch, he lined up all of his nuggets and pierced each of them with his fork before eating them. Inside the facility, the White Room became a sort of classroom. The girl's hand he had insisted on holding for those first few weeks was no longer in reach. He didn't want to grab it, and she no longer tried to hold his hand anymore. The girl with the pigtails didn't cry like she used to. Instead, she stood with wide eyes penetrating thin air. Felix fell into a sort of routine. He slept inside his very own room with the same white walls. And then he would be taken into the big classroom where he would be told to laugh. First, it was rabbits. Then people were brought in. It didn't hurt them. That was what he was told. These people and rabbits knew it was their time. They wanted to die. It was funny. Initially, he didn't believe it was funny. Neither did the other kids. One boy said his mommy had told him all life on Earth deserved to live, and even the trees felt pain. His words were quickly twisted, however. Pain wasn't pain. It was a side effect of euphoria, happiness. Pain, the woman had told them in a booming voice, was the reason why people laughed, why they felt happy. But Felix was skeptical. The rabbits definitely were not enjoying being ripped apart. The adults, who were forced onto their knees, a knife pressed to their throat, screamed and begged for mercy. And he watched with wide eyes, no longer yearning for his mother's warm arms. Felix was one of the first to giggle. He wasn't sure why it was funny, and laughing, he'd come to realize this meant he got candy as a reward. Kids who cried were shoved onto their knees and screamed at. So he laughed. At first he laughed because he didn't want to end up like Sim, who had been dragged away, kicking and screaming when she refused to laugh at the rabbit. But when he started laughing, he couldn't stop. It started like a virus, creeping into his brain and starting to twist and contort his thoughts. Curiosity was burned away, and replacing it was the sudden, inexplicable urge to get closer to the horror show in front of him. Felix wanted to see how the rabbit ticked, how it moved and hopped across tiles, smeared in the brightest shade of red he had ever seen. But it made him smile. The second change in him was subtle at first, though very much a blossoming tumor growing inside of him. But the more people were murdered in front of his unseeing eyes, his laughter started to twist into hysterical giggles he couldn't control. When the mutilated animal was dropped in front of him, he kicked the pile of fur and laughed, starting a sudden cacophony of giggles around him. The next day, he sat cross-legged inside his own room with a rabbit's decapitated head, frowning at its ears. How did it tick? How did it think? How did it hop? He laughed to himself, giggling into smeared red hands. Hop! Felix grabbed the head, making it bounce across the floor. Hop, hop, hoppity hop. As Felix's time at darkroom stretched on, he grew older, but there was never an inclination of that. I sensed him aging, his thoughts much older, as he went from 6 to 7 and then to 8. By the age of 8 years old, he had been assigned his new family inside an apartment bugged with cameras, broadcasting his every move. After seeing what he had done to the rabbit at the age of 7 inside the facility, ripping into its head and dipping his hands into the cavern of its skull, ravaged thoughts with that same question that drove him crazy. How does it tick? I expected him to be a sociopath, but Darkroom was clever. They didn't make psychopaths, at least, not yet. They planted a seed at a very young age, and through cocktails of drugs and subtle influence, Felix lived a considerably normal life inside his new home. There were moments when his actions were heavily influenced. He was left alone in the house with a meat carver sitting on the countertop. Felix's father had been dropping small hints beforehand, which must have engaged the audience watching, because the hints became almost comical. "Don't touch the knife, Fee," his father would say in an over-exaggerated voice, which would settle that ever-growing seed inside his mind. The hints worked. Felix didn't even hesitate. Pushing a chair over to the counter and jumping onto it, he reached for the knife and wrapped his fingers around the handle. For years, Felix acted on these impulsions when he became self-aware of the fact that he wanted to kill. It wasn't until the age of 14 that he gave into it. Ben Matthews was his first friend. The two of them bonded over their shared liking of disturbing videos. Ben's mother was dying of cancer, so the boy wasn't always available. This annoyed him, enough to make him pace his bedroom and bite into his nails until his mouth tasted of blood. Ben's mother was a distraction. She needed to die. However, when he had revealed his amazing plan to Ben, the boy had been horrified, so Felix broke his skull instead. At first his swing missed. The bat slammed into concrete with a crunching sound, and he realized he liked that. But then, impact. Sweet, sweet impact. Felix felt it between his teeth, a sharp thrum running through him, which almost sent him to his knees. He stayed upright, swaying from side to side, a hysterical giggle bursting from his lips, which even he wasn't expecting. Ben stopped moving after 2 hits, though Felix's thoughts didn't stop. Now that he had quenched that urge driving him crazy, another switch had been pulled. This time, it was his dwindling humanity. He knew killing people was wrong, but that seed inside his mind was flowering. The sensation was caught between us, and I felt it. Unbridled pleasure filling his mind, and then mine. But it wasn't enough. Cocking his head, Felix strode over to Ben in 3 strides before lifting his arms and bringing the bat down on the lifeless boy's head. Ben was already dead, but a question hummed in his mind, refusing to let up. How did he... Dick? Ben had laughed and cried. So many thoughts had filled his mind, and Felix found himself wondering how that was possible. The human brain had always made him curious. In fact, he had a vague memory of seeing it for himself as a little kid. Frowning, he crouched and reached a trembling hand, stroking through an obliterated skull and shredded flesh, poking through slithers of brain. Instead of giving into his impulses and delving into the boy's skull to uncover the secrets of the human brain, however, Felix picked up the bat and swung again, this time hitting a home run when Ben's eye popped out. His own lack of empathy confused him. He didn't cry, or at least not much. Instead, he laughed until his stomach was recoiling. Felix knew there was something wrong with him. I could sense his panic and fear of falling completely into the abyss. Darkroom, however, knew this. When he started to look up numbers for therapists and psychiatric wards, his laptop would mysteriously break or his phone would disappear. It wasn't until he woke up, foggy-minded, hanging over the corpses of his father and brother, did it slam into him. Icy cold water coming over him. There was something wrong. There's something wrong with me. The thought danced at the back of his mind when Ben's disappearance was never reported. In fact, it was almost like Ben had never existed. Felix had come close to confessing to killing his friend, but his father and brother always interrupted him with something else. The sound which escaped his mouth when he fully drifted from the fugue state and trapping his mind was deafening. His hands were slick with her blood, every part of him painted, tainted with them. No, his thoughts were foggy and nonsensical, and they hurt me as much as they had him, not them. Until that moment, Felix Delacroix had been sure of one thing. No matter how fucked up he was, he would never hurt his family. That was until his brother's brains covered his hands. Felix's knees hit the floor, and I felt the pain. Agony, which should have been suppressed, which shouldn't have existed to him, filled the boy until he was suffocating, until he was screeching into his hands, sobbing, shaking his head and slamming his fists into his head. Wrong! He screamed over and over until his throat was raw, his chest aching. Wrong, 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 wrong. All at once, I was becoming more and more entangled with not just his mind, but every emotion which had ignited inside him. His urge to kill himself, to stop this insatiable need he didn't understand. Wrong. The words wouldn't leave him alone. Conflicting thoughts spiraling in his mind, starting to drive him crazy. There was something seriously wrong. He said it to himself, whimpered it into his hands when he dunked bloody hands into the bathtub. Hypnotized by red diffused water filling the tub, he grew progressively more confused as over the next few days, there were sharp things everywhere he looked. There was a knife on his desk next to his laptop, a meat cleaver on the floor in front of his brother's room, almost like the world was telling him to play with the bodies of his brother and father. He had already hidden them in the closet, and it wouldn't hurt to look. The thought struck, and in the same breath, he was standing in front of his bedroom closet, grasping the tainted handle. The meat cleaver felt heavy in his hands, though before the thought could blossom, it was slipping from his fingers. His hands went to his hair, clawing out clumps. I'm going crazy. I'm wrong, he thought, because part of it, no matter how much he tried not to think, it felt good, like a suffocating weight being lifted from his chest. Part of him wanted to do it again. It was that particular horrifying thought filling the boy's mind which finally snapped me back to reality. There was a voice, at first faded before climbing into a shrill yell. Reality started to settle in once I managed to pry my eyes open, finding myself surrounded by darkness, a figure looming over me. Felix's present self swam into view. I blinked rapidly, swallowing the shriek building in my throat. Ow! I wasn't sure which one he was, though, judging from the slight crease between his brows and the curl in his lip. I figured it was Kaz. Dude! The boy's voice sounded wrong, like an echo in my skull. There was a ladder, you know. Huh? I gingerly stroked the back of my head, my gaze flicking from the boy's unamused face to the crumbling ceiling. Tunnels, I thought dizzily. These must have been the tunnels underneath the fake town. When I sat up slowly, my vision began to clear. Felix was still in the bloody hospital gown he had been in when I last saw him. The exact same trickle of red staining running from his nose. The boy sighed. There was a ladder, he said. You could have used it, you know, instead of almost giving yourself a concussion. He waved his hands in front of my face. How many fingers am I holding up? I shooed his hands away, reaching out for him to help me up, though to my surprise, he stumbled back, pulling a face. It's probably better if you helped yourself up. His eyes darkened, his lips curving into a smile. No offense. I retracted my hand with a nod. Right, I said. Felix. Let's not go that far. I joined him, drinking in my surroundings. Where are we? I squinted into the dark. Are we still in Brightwood? I didn't see the boy start to walk forwards, only a slight shadow disappearing down the tunnel, his voice ricocheting off the walls. We're on the outskirts, he said. These tunnels are sometimes used for performers to get where they need to be. He paused. You know, like at Disneyland. I'm not completely clued into these tunnels. I just know Sim told me about them. I struggled to keep up with him, watching his silhouette blur in and out of existence. Right. And do you have a plan? He chuckled. No, but you do. Meaning, I countered. It's better not to ask questions. Felix quickened his pace, and I struggled to match it, splashing through puddles of murky water in what I could only presume was waste. We're almost there, he murmured. Down here should be the control room. If you climb there from here, you should be able to get Annalise. There's a hatch in the door and a handle to pull it open. I don't think there are any guards since they are mid-broadcast. Usually they all head into the viewing room. He paused. Or as we infamously call it, the room of all people. Try the laughing track room first. They could be disposing of her. Or they moved her to the Red Room to start reprogramming. He let out a breathy laugh. I'll probably be in there too. Those bastards can't wait to wipe me clean. It was only when I was starting to climb, 1 foot on a metal prong, my hands grasping at rusted metal, did his words slam into me. What? I turned back to him, swallowing barf starting to creep up my throat. Wait, aren't you coming? You're running out of time. You need to get Annalise out of that fucking death room. But you said... He cut me off. Do you really think I just magically got away from them after they successfully ripped Kaz out of me? His words sent icy slithers down my spine. Be serious, El. Felix's voice followed me, and I swore I could feel the prickle of his breath on the back of my neck as I forced myself to climb. Keep going. Almost there. Just a little more, he murmured. I could see the beginning of light start to blossom above me. Who are you? I managed to spit out. The more I questioned his existence, I realized he was right. Kaz had never escaped from Darkroom while I was being forced to live through his memories. I thought back to him disappearing through the trapdoor in my fake mother's bathroom, Kaz's trembling hands morphing into my own, desperately grasping the handle, and things slowly started to make sense in my head. An echo. I'm a footprint left behind after they forced my memories into you. I'm kinda tangled with your subconscious. I almost laughed, my foot slipping on the ladder. You're kidding. Yeah, Sal. His tone dripped sarcasm. In a world where 6-year-olds are kidnapped, forced into the vicious underbelly of the dark web, and brought up to be psycho murderers through brainwashing? Yes. Talking to your subconscious disguised as your classmate is possible. The light above was getting brighter, and I could hear footsteps above me. So, I swallowed hard, continuing to climb. Which one are you? He scoffed. Why? Do you have a favorite? It's a hard choice, right? The junior varsity captain or the brainwashed freak who killed your parents? The boy sighed. Both of them. When they put his memories inside your head, he was both Kaz and Felix. His tone darkened. A mishmash of light and dark. I guess no matter how much these bastards are in denial, Kaz is a part of me. He seeped into me like poison, yet somehow he made me better. Kaz made me feel human again. And if I'm right, they're going to destroy every splinter of him. His words sent something slimy creeping up my throat, and as if realizing he'd said the wrong thing, Felix's tone softened. You need to hurry up. I don't mean to push you, but I don't have much time. It's a ticking clock, and Annalise and I are their best assets. But I struggled to swallow my words. They were suffocating my mouth. I had to know if this version of him existed, an entanglement of both Kaz and Felix. There was a possibility that his mind wasn't gone, and Kaz was still buried in there. Annoyingly, my subconscious mind with Kaz's voice could read me like a book. I'm pretty sure we're both about to get Ava's treatment. I stopped climbing, the breath catching in my throat. Ava? His voice faltered for a moment, fading in and out before stabilizing itself. Ava was for influencers who weren't responding well to the Red Room treatment. If any of us ended up with Ava, it was practically a death sentence. I felt it again, the prick of his breath in the back of my neck. If you think I'm a fucking psycho now, wait until Ava's finished with me. They normally use her for influencers that they really want to make an impression on. Even influencers who were fucked in the head were scared of her. That bitch was our physical embodiment of a warning. He paused. Or if we come out of the programming, she's a last resort, I guess. The Red Room procedure is permanent, but as you saw with me, Its effects did weaken over time because of the Kaz implant developing human emotions. If you don't want me to sugarcoat it, they will be using Ava on me to make sure Kaz doesn't come back. I couldn't breathe suddenly, and I was already thinking of it before he spoke my thoughts out loud. And, Felix said through a sigh, you won't be able to save me this time. Ava takes away every splinter of humanity. His voice shook, and they want to make a brand new Felix, who was never tainted by Kaz. The Felix they engineered from the age of 8 to 15 years old. The fucking psychopath who killed your family and then dragged you into this. I could tell the boy was inside my mind, reading my thoughts and bringing them to the forefront. He laughed. The bastard who sliced your sister's brain up, Elle. That's who they want back. And Elise. Felix's memory was still fresh in my mind, intoxicating delight filling him as he sliced the blade through her flesh. But they haven't, I found myself saying through gritted teeth. This time his voice was faded, more of an echo in my head. They haven't done anything to you, I repeated. Darkroom couldn't have done that. I swallowed. Using Ava, I mean, because you still exist. That's not how it works, Al. I climbed faster, the tone of his voice sending my heart catapulting into my throat. What's that supposed to mean? I waited for Felix's reply, but it never came, his voice as well as the lingering presence inside my skull fading away. Before I knew it, I was alone, drowning in a suffocating silence and my own panting breaths when I reached the control room, grasping onto the ladder for dear life. Following his words, I blindly reached for the metal hatch and pulled it open. No sign of anyone when I peeked my head through. The place was exactly what I had been expecting. A large room full of TV screens, all hooked up to one scary-looking device via a multitude of wires. I saw my face on the wall. Jessa Pollux, Kaz, and Joey Cunningham. All of us smiling widely with blank, oblivious eyes. Felix was right. There was nobody there. Lifting myself through the hatch, I straightened up, taking in my surroundings. Felix said the red room was next door. I started towards the exit, my heart in my throat, before something stopped me abruptly, a familiar presence creeping into my body and mind. This time, it fought to take control, pulling me back. Wait! Felix's voice was more of a sharp inhalation of breath, rattling my skull. I felt his phantom hands grasp hold of my shoulders, a wave of his emotions coming over me. Terror. It sliced into me like a knife, followed by an agonizing pain thrumming in the back of my skull. But it wasn't me who was feeling it. It was him. Something... The boy's ghostly voice trembled, and I could sense him using me to frantically search for pursuers. Elle, something is... He cried out suddenly, a gut-wrenching screech that almost sent me to my knees. His whimper collapsed into a sob, and I found myself spiraling like him, drowning in a sudden darkness seeping into him. Worse than the screen of red which had contorted his mind, worse than the rods staring his brain into mush. This was merciless torture taking hold of him. His cries continued drowning my thoughts, morphing into childish walls. Please, there's something in my head. Elle. The familiar voice sputtering from an intercom brought me back to reality. I knew him. It was the gruff murmur who had mentally tortured Felix, who told me to be still when I struggled, strapped to a table while he pressed metallic plates to my forehead and face. The doors in front of me slid open automatically, and several guards came through. Wait. The man cleared his throat. There is no need for that. I want our L to learn the hard way. The hard way? A spotlight was switched on, illuminating me, and when I tried to get away, the light followed my frantic dancing footsteps until I was pressed against the wall. Felix's voice had been cruelly severed inside of my head. I couldn't hear his cries anymore. I couldn't feel him. That familiar tangle of our thoughts and memories interloped together. He was my only inclination that Felix or Kaz was worth saving, that I could walk out of Brightwood with both Kaz and Annalise. Elle, if you would like to turn your attention to the screen in front of you, I would like to show you something. Annalise. My voice came out more of a choked sob. I didn't realize how close I was to breaking down until I said her name. Ah, yes, your sister is fine. In fact, due to a sudden boost in popularity on our polls, Annalise Duval will remain in Brightwood. Our original plan was to dispose of her. The girl's mental state was definitely a problem we could not risk. However, that is where the Red Room comes in. His voice reminded me of a reality TV show host. But we will not be focusing on Annalise. What? He chuckled. Our audience knows about your, let's call it, an infatuation with a certain classmate. And they love it. If we move away from Brightwood for a moment, the behind-the-scenes antics between the two of you have been all we've been talking about over the last few days. And my, did you give us some juice. We actually reached a new milestone, almost 4 million views in one day. What we wanted, Elle, was for you to accept the urge and finally go on a much-anticipated rampage through town. However, due to certain circumstances, your escape and everything in between was broadcasted when our viewers demanded it. The screen in front of me lit up, and I was treated to a comically bad slideshow set to a Whitney Houston ballad with snapshots of Kaz and me grasping onto each other in an attempt to escape the facility before he was caught. Crazy. The man let out an exaggerated sigh, and I was greeted by the footage of Sim and Felix slicing open my mother's throat. We showed you exactly what he had done, this time from his perspective, and somehow you still pity a sociopath. His tone darkened. Felix Delacroix is sick. We have been in denial for a long time, but it is true. The problem is not inside the device which made him into Kaz Isaacs. It is rooted inside his brain, a poison which had crept into his thoughts and undone all our hard work. The screen flickered again. This time I was staring at a small room with light green walls. There was nothing in there except a single wooden chair, and strapped to it was Kaz. I could tell it was Kaz because his eyes were wild and feral with fright, desperate to get away. But there was also a part of him which was Felix, snarling like an animal, screaming threats through the speaker. "Get me out," he said in a sharp cry. Get me out of here." His eyes found the camera. "Elle, Annalise." Pulling against the restraints pinning him down, he struggled violently, attempting to kick himself off of the chair. You've seen the Red Room procedure, correct? The man's voice was nothing but a low murmur in the back of my head as I struggled to take in the boy's state. He was exactly what I'd hoped for. Enough Kaz to retain his humanity, while the lingering parts of Felix fought like an animal. Elle, I asked you a question. The word was slipping from my mouth before I could stop it. Yes. Good. Now, allow me to introduce what we call a last resort. Felix Delacroix is too soft, poisoned by the faulty tooth affecting his mind. The boy is now a liability to Darkroom. After being brought up in front of a camera, our viewers have watched him blossom into the perfect killer. Now they want him removed from Brightwood altogether, and we cannot have that. He choked out a laugh. All of our hard work for one of our influencers to be kicked off the very program they have spent their entire lives on? Felix will rejoin Brightwood. We will be bringing the boy back to his precious roots by means of correction.
Ow!
His voice sent shivers down my spine.
Al, can you hear me? Al, can you hear me?
His frantic gaze scanned the room.
They're using me to break you,
he panted.
And then they're going to use Annalise.
He rocked on the chair, cursing.
But you can't let them get into your head, okay? They want a fucking show. Don't give them one. Leave the two of us and get the fuck out.
See? What did I tell you guys? The man must have been talking to the audience. Ah, young love. The announcer sighed over Kaz's vocal death threats. The boy is out of his mind and not in the way our audience wants. I glimpsed a shadow bleed into existence behind the struggling boy. It was a red-haired woman, the same redhead who had snapped the rabbit's neck in front of 6-year-old Felix and a dozen other children. Elle, you are familiar with our darkroom method, are you not? The announcer murmured into the microphone as I watched Felix's arms sternly strapped down. Ava's treatment works in a similar way. However, instead of tricking the brain into thinking positively when seeing something horrific, instead, it will be more of a manual reset. Ava may not be a current employee of ours. However, she did lead the research in engineering 6-year-old children into potential psychopaths. Already well known as an ex-CIA officer, I can assure you. His voice broke out into an excited giggle. She knows what she's doing. I had already witnessed this, I thought dizzily, feverishly watching the red-haired woman produce 2 needle-like rods. I had already felt this through him. When the first rod entered the back of his skull and Felix's body jolted, a screech ripping from his lips, I felt my knees hit the ground. Really, Elle? If now is the time for honest hours, we would like to admit that this isn't all about Felix Delacroix. In fact, we are more confident that he will be exactly who we want to be once his correction has been completed. Something catapulted me to my feet, and I was stumbling, staggering towards the door and throwing my fists against it. The stupid thing wouldn't open.
Guys!
Believe me, you are yelling at a ghost. The announcer's words sent my thoughts into a tailspin as I battered my fists into rusted metal. Ever since you became Brightwood Zell, you have repeatedly refused to take part in the killing, which has angered our viewers. His voice somehow rose above Felix's screams for death as he rattled on the chair, beads of red beginning to slip from his mouth and nose. When he started to speak with a tangled tongue, his expression contorting from pain and terror to the start of a grimace creeping into a smile, I stopped throwing myself against the door. It was the same smile he pulled when he gagged my screams as Sim thrust a blade of her knife into my father's skull. I was suddenly aware of my own cry, my clammy palm pressed over my ears, trying to block out the memories once again bleeding inside me and taking a vicious unyielding hold. Consider this your very own Red Room treatment. The announcer chuckled before the boy went limp suddenly, his grip on the armrests relaxing, his head bouncing forwards on his chest. He continued, even when Felix on screen wasn't moving, and the red-haired woman was wiping the ends of the rods with a handkerchief. The first real peek into your own personal despair, which, he was talking to the audience now, his tone a shrill squeak of excitement, will finally give us our L.